Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Laura L. Engel. Really looking forward to our conversation today, Laura.
Thank you. I am too.
Yeah. There's something magic about speaking with birth mums for me. You know? And I'm getting goosebumps just saying that. It's a sense of togetherness. I don't know quite what happens. Anyway, it's a lovely mystery. So, before we started recording, you said that writing your memoir, your book, it felt like you getting a boulder off your back.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's hard to explain, but for 50 years, I carried such grief and shame over leaving my son at an unwed mother's home that it affected me in ways I wasn't even aware of. For instance, I didn't even write about it in my journals, and I've always written in my journals and diaries.
Oh, you couldn't even write about it to yourself?
No,
Wow.
Because, and this is going to sound so crazy now, but with my other children, they didn't know about my son that I had given up. And I was always worried, what if they find my journal and read it? And I have all this information in there, and they're like, what is mom talking about? That kind of thing, which is so silly now when I think about it, because I don't think my kids would ever read my journals. I really wonder if they would. But it's like, once I started writing about it, it was crazy. It was about 6 months before my son and I reunited. I had come to the conclusion that I would probably never meet him, because 50 years had gone by and I had searched, but I never got an inkling that he was looking for me. So I would write about, things about New Orleans in my journals, but I would put N-O, which was that was the unwed mother's home, was in New Orleans. So that was my little code to myself that I was writing. Like I would say something like, for instance, I'm thinking about N-O today, and da. So finally I got the courage on my own, writing in my journal, to just start writing, about what happened and the truth. And the more I wrote, the better I felt. It was almost like I told you, it was almost like something, like a stone or a boulder was lifted off my shoulders, that I could freely write about it. I'd never talked to a therapist about it. And I've gone to therapy for other things during my life, but like a divorce thing and, that kind of thing. But I'd never really specifically gone to therapy for what had happened to me as a 17-year-old girl, and about my fear and worry about my son. Like, what happened to him? Where is he? Because in a closed adoption, as you know nothing. And so the unknown is pretty terrifying, really. And once I started writing, I became more at peace with the whole thing, never dreaming I would write a book about it at that time. And I'm a true believer in manifestation, because many times when I've written about things, or my, what my goals are or what I want in life, a lot of times it'll happen. It's almost like magic. It'll just, it'll happen, it'll manifest. Yeah. And so never dreaming about doing that with my son, but I started writing Find Jamie at the type. That's what I named my son. So I started writing Find Jamie at the top of each page of my journal. And that went on for 6 months, because I really, in my heart, wanted to find him, but I honestly didn't know what would happen afterward. What happened was, as you know, the universe doesn't always pan out the way we plan it to. They have surprises. It has surprises for us. And the surprise was, my son found me, even though I was writing Find Jamie, Find Jamie. But I think the step that made it start, the whole step of starting to reunite and find each other, was my writing about it finally, and opening myself up to the possibility that this would happen, this could happen. And 6 months later it did.
Yeah.
And I didn't even think about all this until after the fact, when I started going through the synchronicities of all the things that added up to finding each other.
So I want to take you back to the top there, because there's quite a lot to dig through. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this on another podcast recently, or maybe when it was just in one of my other conversations. Somebody shared this with me, the difference between shame and guilt, because you mentioned shame and guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And it was apparently Brene Brown has made has made a nice distinction between the two. So shame is about who we are, and guilt is about what we've done.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big distinction there.
There is. You're right.
By who we are and what we do. So how would you see that distinction?
I completely agree with that, because in my mind, no matter what was happening in my life in those 50 years, there was always that the shame was when we were girls in the unwed mother's home, and not only in the unwed mother's home, the whole society was that if we ended up pregnant and unmarried, shame on us. What had we done? We were terrible girls to have done that. And we bought into it. At least just about everyone I ever talked to bought into it that was in that situation. We were made to feel like we had done something that was so deplorable, and they were going to fix it for us by, pretty much forcing us to relinquish our baby. And we were told that was the only way that we could show how much we loved this child, because we couldn't take care of a child alone. We're talking the 1960s. It was hard to be a single mother. It still is today, but it was for a teenage girl like me, there was no other choice in their opinions. And when I say they, I mean society, family, our minister, school, everywhere. You were kicked out of school immediately if you were pregnant. There was no way you were going to continue to go to school in 1960s. And that was the shame of it. You were made to feel like you had done a terrible thing. The second part, the guilt, was in my mind, I always felt like I should have done more. I should have fought for my child. I should have demanded. But I was not who I am today when I was 17 years old. And I didn't know how to demand it. The way I tried to, it's in the book, my attempts to change my parents' mind didn't go anywhere. And I felt like I had no backup behind me.
So it feels like they kind of really ganged up on you.
Yeah, but that was typical back then. It was, I've had a lot of adoptees talk to me, and I love talking to adoptees the way you said you love talking to birth mothers. There is a magical thread. There is some type of connection with all adoptees I talk to. And I feel like almost every one of them ask me the same question, eventually, if they don't ask it right at first. Is it true that you thought of your son every day? Because I always say that, and I wrote that in my book, because I did. And I say, yes, it's very true. How could I not think about him, worry about him, wonder where he was? So yes, definitely, I did think about him every day. And I feel like in a way that gives them some kind of understanding of a typical birth mother. I do not think in the 1960s wanted to do what she was made to do. I never met one that was like, yay, this is, easy. It's not, it wasn't. It was horrible.
But there was kind of like, you were facing them all alone, though.
Yes, you were very much alone.
You were facing them more alone, and the mind is, so you had no choice. You had no choice. You had no chance. Well, both. You had no choice and you had no chance. It was like, but the mind doesn't let us off the hook like that, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And writing was so therapeutic for me, because once I did start like just letting it out on the page, there's some kind of connection, and I'm sure there's a much better way of saying this, but when you put a pen to paper and you write what's going on in your life or your feelings or what's in your heart and soul, it is so therapeutic. It's like it takes the writing is straight from your heart, your brain to your pen, and there's some kind of magical thing that happens. It's a very therapeutic thing, whether you're writing a list of what I'm grateful for, or whether you're writing this happened to me, or a letter that you're going to destroy later, which happens too. There was just something therapeutic, and it helped to relieve a lot of that guilt that I had, because for once I began to realize who I had been. I wasn't me now. That was a girl. That was a younger version of me in a totally different chapter of my life. And I didn't have a choice. I had very little support. And I think that it made me a stronger person probably than I ever would have been if I hadn't had that happen. It also made me very non-judgmental, as far as realizing, okay, I know I'm a good person and I'm being treated like I'm not. And how many other people does this happen to that I don't know the full story? So from then on, I really have felt very strongly about not judging others.
I mean, you said there was no support or very little support. Well, it was as you've explained it to me ahead of time, it was exactly the opposite.
It was. Every turn.
What's the opposite of support?
No support. I mean, every time you turn around, every avenue, you thought you would get. I was
Blocked.
kind of there was a wall everywhere. There was never someone that said, come here, tell me what you want to do. Tell me what you think you can do. Tell me how I can help you. It was like nobody in the 1960s, parents didn't even ask you how you felt, because, it was like, whatever. And it was a totally different kind of generational type of conversation with parents and children than there is now. We pretty much did what they told us to do. And when you were 17 in 1967 or 66, I guess is when I was 17 and turned 17, you were not the 17-year-old that we know today, or even in my children's generation, in your generation. It was because you would be like my, son. You're so close in age and everything.
Yeah.
I think you're like same age.
Yeah.
And it was a different world. We did what they told us to do. But the more I wrote about it and the more I thought about it and forced myself to remember those painful memories, I realized first of all, my parents, they didn't know what to do. They were horrified. They thought, what had I done to the family reputation and to myself? I had destroyed myself. My boyfriend, who had wanted nothing to do with me, his family, they wanted him. He preferred joining the army to marrying me, and Vietnam was going on. And then that made me feel, like dirt. And then you had, the schools, you can't go to school once they find out. And you can't tell your friends, because what are they going to think of you? Good girls don't do this, right? And there was never people you could talk to. And once you got to the home, you could talk to the other girls. But I don't remember us ever really I don't remember us having deep conversations, to be honest. It was very surface type things. It was a painful time.
Yeah. I mean, we touched briefly on it. You touched briefly on it, and I kind of brushed it over, but I want to go back to it. The fact that you were suppressing this stuff so hard, you couldn't even write about it in your own diary, your diary to yourself. I mean, that's like, it's like, it's incredible, isn't it? I mean, how powerful.
I look at it now and I think, what in the world were you thinking? People don't come in and into your, private space and open your journal and start reading it. But I had this, I kept it such a secret. And I think I told you this before, Simon. The only thing I had to prove that I had my son was the little birth card that's on the cover of my book. That's the original birth card. And I stole it from his bassinet and carried it with me for 50 years in a little box. I still have it in the drawer here in my desk. I kept it in a little box, and I used it when like his birthdays, I would hold it to my heart. And I remember this happened every year on holidays and birthdays. I would secret myself away. This is how ashamed I was. I felt people would think so less of me if they knew that I had done this. I knew other people had given up children for adoption. I knew that this was something that was not like, I wasn't the only one in the world, but I was so protective of that secret. And I know it had to have damaged me in many ways, because once I released it, wrote about it, talked about it, I can't tell you the relief I felt, because all these years I've been thinking people would think less of me. And when I would talk to them at first about my son, when we first reunited, and I started my conversation off with this with my own children that I'd had later, I said, don't think less of me, please. So that's what my mindset was. And I'm thinking the only way it could have been that way is if it had been pounded in me to never talk about this, which it was. That's another thing. You couldn't talk about it. Once you left the home, there was no one to talk to because no one wanted to talk about it. And the few people that knew in my life shut me down the minute I'd start talking about my son or how I wanted to go back or I wanted him back, because I went through a period of that as well for the first 3 weeks being home. And I talk about that too. It was like they expected me to go on with my life like, everything was great, but everything wasn't great. I was changed. I was a mother without my son.
Were you ashamed of your shame?
Yes, I was. My husband knew, because I had told him before we got married. My second husband, my first husband knew too. That's a whole nother story. But my husband that I've been married to for 42 years, he would always say to me, we met on a soccer field, and he has 2 children. I had 3 boys. He had a boy and a girl. And we would do things together as, friends. And then we, fell in love. And he would say, you're such a good mom. You're such a good mom. And one day I just said, I need to tell you something. I did something that you don't know about. I don't know how you're going to feel about me after I tell you. And when I told him, I expected him to be like my first husband and be like, don't ever talk about this. This is terrible, and he just went crazy, the first husband, demanding that I keep it a secret. Well, then my second husband, years later, when I told him, I expected a similar reaction. The reaction was just the opposite. He put his arms around me and said, I am so sorry you had to go through that. Do you want me to help you find him? And I thought, my God, this man is wonderful. If anything ever sealed the deal, that was it. Because for me, that was my darkest time. And he reacted so caring. And and didn't think less of me. So I think a lot of us birth mothers, and I think I told you this too one time in our conversation, so many of them still feel that way, that they can't talk about it. And I know that for a fact because I connected with a few of the mothers from the home. And we're talking over 50 years later, 55 years later, and they still cannot talk about it. And they still have not told people in their family or their friends. And it really angers me to think that this whole, hundreds of thousands of women were treated that way. And so many men were not. It was like the fathers, nobody even mentions the fathers. It's like, what happened to those men? What were they thinking? Were they in pain? Did they feel guilty? So sometimes when I was writing, I would get angry, and I would think, how dare them treat us like this? Because I used to say, when I first started writing my book, I'd say, I don't want to feel like a victim. I told my writing coach in a class, I go, I want my book to be, I don't want it to sound like a poor me, because it wasn't like, I wasn't raped or, it was a consensual thing. And I felt very, very guilty about it, that part of it was true. It was. And so I think that was so uplifting for me to realize that it wasn't like I had done, I knew that I hadn't done the wrong thing. I did what everyone did. I got caught, but I had been made to suffer. So I had to control myself. I was getting angry in my writing, and my writing coach said, but you were a victim. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I said, oh, because I've always been afraid of looking like a victim because I didn't feel like I really was. But I think when I think of the other women, I think they were treated badly. So why don't I just understand I was too?
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. Was there a moment when, you remember the moment when you first started getting this stuff out onto you?
When I first started what?
When you first, presumably, do you remember the first time you actually plucked up the courage to write about it in the book, in your diary? Sorry, in your diary.
Oh yes, I do. And it happened in, I was in an Artist Way class. Do you know what that is? Have you heard of The Artist Way?
All right, okay.
It's Julia Cameron wrote the book maybe 30 years ago. And I bought the book 30 years ago, but then I didn't even open it, I don't think. And then when I retired, I said, I want to take an Artist Way class, because this class is supposed to help you, find your creativity and, be brave enough to do things that you've always thought, I'm not good at that. I want to do it, but I'm not that good. Anyway, it's supposed to be a very intense, great class. And it was. But one of the things in the class is that Julia Cameron says, if there was anything you could do, if there was anything you could achieve, and money was not an option, your family was not an option. I mean, it wasn't in the way. It was an obstacle. Money wasn't an obstacle. There was no obstacle. Okay, what would you do? And so you're supposed to write a list of like 10 things. Well, it's hard to do, by the way. The first thing I wrote without even thinking, hand, paper, the pen, the heart, the head, I wrote, find Jamie. And I thought I had finally come to the conclusion I probably would never meet him. So every day I started doing that in that class. And even writing those words the first time, one of my close friends was in the class with me, and she sat right next to me. And here's what I even thought to myself. I wonder if she's wondering who Jamie is. Because our notebooks were so close to each other, we could see if we really looked over there. And that's how I was. I mean, it's crazy now when I tell you, but it's the truth. And so about 4 months later, after this class, we were writing all the time, our list in the class and stuff like that. And so one day I told her, something I'd never told anyone in California, none of my friends. We were going for a walk after the class, and I said, I have something to tell you. We sat down we were in this very crowded, it's called Seaport Village in San Diego, and it's a very tourist area. And we were walking there, just going for a walk. So we sat down in this crowded area, and it just spilled out of me, my story about my son. And she did exactly the opposite of what I thought she would do. I thought she would be like, oh my gosh, how could you do that? How could you leave a baby? Because she and I always talk about is our kids and being mothers and grandmothers. And she did just the opposite. She said, I am so sorry. I'll help you look for him. And I mean, she just was so gentle and kind about it. And it kind of made me realize, what's wrong with me? Why am I thinking everyone is just going to be so, like, this is 1967. This is, and this is time for you. This was 2016 when this was happening. So I remember when I first opened up writing about it, and I first spoke the words out loud. And I came home that day from the walk, and I said to my husband, I told Jill. And he said, you told Jill what? And I said, I told her about Jamie. And he said, wow. And I could see he was proud of me, that I'd finally been able to speak the words about my son.
Yeah. So I heard something from one of my teachers talking about shame being like a vortex.
Mm.
And so it's pulling you down. That's what vortexes do. And the instant reaction I came up with was, I thought about a conversation I had with a girl 30 odd years ago, my first date with this girl. And she said, as we said goodbye, I feel like I'm falling off a cliff.
Mm.
And I still don't know whether I realized she meant I was falling in love. I can't figure it out,
Yeah.
But I think my instant reaction was kind of, that's a bad thing. Not falling in love, falling off a cliff.
Yes.
I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. But I've definitely felt that vortex feeling. But it's almost as if, so I've got two kind of metaphors for shame, and that come to mind as I've been thinking today, because I knew it would be a conversation. It would be a big part of our conversation today because of what we talked about last time. So the first idea, and because you're a writer, you'll get this about the metaphor, is that the shame is a vortex, and it sucks a load of other stuff in. So it kind of did it start with getting pregnant? The shame was the stuff before that there was the shame as well, or did getting pregnant, did that mark the beginning of the sport, the vortex spinning?
I think yes. I did have a pretty dysfunctional mother, and there were times when I was growing up that I was ashamed of her and ashamed of things that went on. There was a lot of secrets of her behavior, and always trying to appear one way and realizing what was really going on at home, that type of thing. I think it led me as a young woman to probably be looking for love in places I shouldn't have been. And I had a father I know loved me, but at the same time, he was a very quiet man and was kind of in the background at that time in my life. And I think that led to me, doing probably things I shouldn't have done. And then I end up pregnant, which is just, back then, I don't think there was much you could do worse than that as a young woman in the 60s. And what happened, I believe what you said is so true. Other things start coming into that shame. You never, or how it affected me, I should say, is I never felt like I was quite enough. And don't get me wrong, I had a good life. I've had, many successes in my life. But there was always that feeling of I'm not quite who I should be. And I think it just layered and layered and layered over the years. And it all stemmed from not being who I should have been. I should have not had let that happen. And then the shame of how it all played out. I for years fantasized about my son. They wanted me to change my name. In the unwed mother's home, they make you feel so secretive and so ashamed. They wanted you to change your name, never tell the girls your real name. And even on all your records, they would change a name. And that's the only thing I stood up and said, no, I won't do. And here's why. I had this, got to remember, I'm a kid. I had this fantasy that if I kept my name on, it would be on the birth certificate and my son would be able to find me. And even as young and naive as I was, something inside of me said, do not change your name. Keep your name. So as ashamed as I was, I still kept my name. So there was still that little part of me that was like, I shouldn't be ashamed of this. This is because here's what they would tell you. This will follow you. People will be able to look up the records and see you were here. And then when I did see the birth certificate that he had from his parents, it was mother unknown. After all those years of me thinking my name would make him find me. So, the records were so sealed, as you know. And it's crazy. It's crazy how it all played out and how the shame just builds and builds, and you don't even realize that you are as ashamed as you are. Still silly, because life goes on and you didn't do a horrible thing.
Yeah. Because I've been trying to figure out, I don't know whether I told you this when we spoke last, but I do mention it quite a lot, that business has caused me far more emotional pain than adoption, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the business stuff has been chronic for 30 years.
Yeah.
Whereas the adoption stuff has been more like acute. Yeah, it's been very painful, brief interludes. And I reckon I put it at about 40 seconds. Conscious stuff. And like how much is subconscious? Who knows? Like you're into you're into a strange world of pontification that gets you nowhere, I don't think, really. But I saw those two things as separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not good enough in business, not good enough. My birth mother, Patricia, didn't love me enough to keep me. That was this 20 seconds of stuff that came out when I was in a bad place. I was in a bad place for business, actually. So, and the context of the conversation was angry. So was anger about not being heard. In a conversation in a setting that was nothing to do with adoption. I don't know
Right.
if that makes any sense.
It does.
So I've been seeing these two things as separate, and people tell me, oh well, it's the same thing. You know, the business stuff, the insecurity from the business is down to the insecurity about adoption. I'm like, I haven't got a clue really. And does it matter? Do you know, like, does understanding the source actually do any good or not? And yeah, I kind of, because it intrigues me to a certain extent, but what intrigues me more is finding a different way to see it, to see how these two kind of sit together. So when I heard this mentor of mine talking about a vortex and sucking in everything else, it really made sense to me, because, you know, like, I can see with me, I can see some shame around peeing my pants in school when I was 8. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I can see some shame with having buck teeth. I had buck teeth that stood out. I can see some shame that was layered on through some bullying. Right. So I can see the vortex starting to spin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. But then really starting to spin faster with business, like in my 20s, my 30s, and my 40s. So it feels like it's a spinning thing. So what we're looking at is, rather than me compartmentalizing my stuff, I see it all together. And then when we're looking at the shame vortex, and then it's almost it's almost as if, and I got this analogy from somebody else, a guy called, he didn't use the shame button, didn't use shame word, but a guy called Richard Wilkins, who, him and his partner, now his wife, have been my mentors in very initially on the stuff I was facing like 14, 15 years ago. So if anybody wants to check out my source, check it. It's called Richard Wilkins. It's a Ministry of Inspiration. So credit where credit's due. But here's the metaphor, right? So I'm looking at you on a screen. Behind that screen, there's loads of documents, right? There's loads of documents, and documents, and there's JPEGs, and there's video files, and there's audio files, and I'm not the best, right, at keeping my desktop tidy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I take all those different files, all those different memories that I've got, right? So like it doesn't take me much now to tell you that I'm ashamed of peeing my pants when I was 8, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for years I kept that a secret. So if I've got that little memory, and then I've got the being called a bucktooth boy, and like ratty and rodent, which I got a lot of at school. So got all those little different incidents, and you've got the incidents of the patrol leader guy on scout camp, the 14-year-old kid telling me that I was a wasteless, when I messed up, I was a worthless piece of effing S, right? And then I put all the business stuff where I've hired the wrong people, made financial errors, taken gambles, not taking gambles, all sorts of different things, right? I could, because I've got a Mac, I could control click those, put those all together, and put them into a bin, and the bin's called shame.
Mm. Yes.
And once I know that they're in the bin, it's not that I've forgotten about them, but I only know that I'm only dealing with one thing. I've not got to. So if it's not that, if it's not a messy desktop, it's a game of whack-a-mole, right? So as soon as you get rid of the business trauma, then the adoption trauma pops up, and as soon as you get rid of that one, then the bullying pops up, and you're constantly fighting to try and I'm constantly fighting to try and whack each mole down, which is funny, really, because my nickname is Moley, right? Okay, so because my wife says we call each other Mole, right? When I get out of the shower, my hair's wet at the back. She says I look like a mole, and 30 years ago, stuff, right? But can you see the difference? Like, we're only dealing with one thing, dealing with the shame thing, or we're only dealing with one thing. We're not having to deal with all those different things, and then we can bring the So does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. It's funny you said. I was thinking about how my whole life this morning, I was thinking about this when I woke up, because I knew we'd be talking. I've been able to compartmentalize all the sections of my life, but that little, shame, or the little thing on my shoulder or in my heart was always there, kind of the little dark, secret. And I would be able to, go to work, do what I needed to do, be who I needed to be, and not think about it constantly. But then driving home, it would come over me. It was just, it never left. It never left. And it made me very anxious. I think a lot of anxiety I've had throughout my life has stemmed from that kind of weird thing that won't go away with the shame. And I will be honest with you right now, I still have moments of that. As much as I've come to terms with it, as much as my reunion was absolutely beautiful, as much as strength as I got from writing the book, and the therapeutic, wonderful benefits of being able to talk about adoption now, learn about adoption. I wouldn't even read a book about adoption, by the way. I avoided it. I was like a ostrich with my head in the sand. If there was a movie on the TV about adoption, I would tell my husband, I can't watch this. I didn't learn all the things that I've learned now. And maybe it was self-protection, I don't know. But now I really look forward to learning as much as I can, because I realized I wasn't wrong. It was a horrible thing. It was a terrible thing. But I was wrong about thinking it was all my fault. So yeah.
So I asked you if you were ashamed of being ashamed, and you said yes. So for me, what happened when you wrote down you went to the writing class, and you gave yourself permission to write down about your shame. So instead of it was almost like stopping the trauma spinning, the trauma vortex spinning.
It did.
Yeah, stopped it. You stopped it. You had a look at it, and you brought it out of the darkness into the light of awareness. And have you heard me talking about the trauma ball? You heard me talking about this?
Yes.
Do you remember what that is?
No, explain again exactly. I've heard you say the term.
Yeah. Isn't it funny? Look what I just did. I'm doing do you remember? And then you said, I'm asking you to repeat it like I'm in class or something. Isn't that really rude?
That's okay.
Yeah. I guess I'm going to put a self-defense area. I'm interested. No, I'm not. I was just being what we call in England a dickhead. So the trauma ball, it's like a snowball. The trauma ball is like a snowball, or a shame ball, right? It's the same thing.
Bigger and bigger as it rolls down the hill.
Yeah. So yeah. Yes, it does. It gets bigger. First first it happens, right? Or somebody puts a seed in our head. I
Mhm.
was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and they were saying that they'd seen a therapist, and the therapist had said, so she wasn't aware of any stuff. She was an adoptee, she wasn't aware of any stuff to do with it, and this shrink said, well, of course, it started with your loss. It hadn't been a thing, and then it becomes a thing.
Mm.
And then you got to deal with it, haven't you? It becomes a thing. So the trauma ball or the shame ball, it works like a snowball. So something happens and we become aware, and this happened to me actually with the primal wound stuff. So when we become aware, when I became aware of the primal wound, right, I bent down. It was like I bent down on a snow field, a snow-covered yard, as you would call them. Yards are concrete in the UK, right? When you say yard, I think you mean like a concrete yard, like a prison yard. You mean grass, and could be anything, right? So a snow-filled garden, it doesn't really matter whether it's concrete underneath the snow or grass underneath the snow. I don't know why I went down that particular rabbit. Anyway, so you bend down, you pick up, you scoosh some snow together, you roll it between your hands, and you make it into like an egg-shaped size, right? And then you roll that little ball along the ground, and you're doing it. That the ego is doing this, right? Body is the body, the hands that's doing it is the metaphor for the ego. So the ego is getting more and more scared and more traumatized, and the shame is growing. The vortex is spinning. I'm using all my metaphors here, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And you said, oh well, it rolls downhill, so it gets up more speed, right? So it gets up more speed, and you feel like you're spinning out of control. That's what the vortex is doing. It's spinning you out of control, and then something happens, right? So maybe it's been rolling downhill, and it hits a plateau, and it stops. Somehow it stops. You look at what it is, right? You looked at what it is, and looking at this trauma ball, the light of awareness goes on the trauma ball, and it works like an industrial heater, and the trauma ball turns from snow to a puddle, and you keep the light of awareness on the puddle, and the puddle evaporates, and you realize there's nothing there.
Oh, it's just water.
No, it's gone. It's vapor. It's
air.
vapor. It's
air. It's air. Oh.
But it looked like a boulder.
Yeah, and it felt like one.
It looked like a boulder. It felt like a boulder. It smelled like a boulder.
Yeah, yeah. It's just crazy how many writers, and not just writers, people taking classes just to write for themselves, or just people not necessarily thinking about writing a book, but people who are just in classes I've gone to for the last 6 years. It's amazing how you hear all the time how therapeutic it's been for them to write about not necessarily my story, but we all have stories. We all have stories, whether we're adopted or a birth mother, or that's never even entered the picture in our family. There's always the stories that we are either ashamed of, or things that we felt, we still feel grief over that's unhealed. And for me, it was very huge how much it helped. I I mean, I tell everyone now they need to keep a journal or write down, like, even if it's just to write a list every day, because I do feel it's healthy. It's like, it's almost like a walking. It's like an exercise. You know, it's that same kind of, I wrote it down. Now I can either sort it out, figure out what really did happen. And I think you learn so much about yourself. It's a very strong thing to do.
So when I'm walking, I'm listening to stuff, and then I send myself an email. And when I get back home from walking, Rosie, I write the stuff down.
That's really a good idea.
So the one that seems appropriate to share, and my top ones are in the front of the book. So here's one that seems really, I never use this word, opposite. Feeling quite smug about using that. Relevant, I guess, to our conversation. Bad feelings are our allies, not our enemies. So the bad feeling, the feeling of shame, I have seen as an enemy, and I guess you have too, and we've shoved it down. But it was a sign that our thinking was off. It wasn't a sign that we were bad. So that's why, so I used to worry, and then I'd worry about worrying.
Yes. I'm the same thing.
And then I'd worried about worrying. And so it would grow. And as a guy who I mentor I've learned a lot from in your part of the world on the West Coast, a guy called Michael Neal, says, then you become a moron. More on your mind.
More on your mind.
More on.
I like it.
And then another one I've got on here is, what if my mind is wrong?
That's good. What if it is?
Yeah. And another one, again, really relevant, and I'll shut up after that. Am I fearing my feelings? Am I fearing my feelings? Because back to the trauma ball, the snowball.
It's true.
The light of awareness melts it. So writing about it has the same effect, or a similar effect, to talking about it. It brings it out of the darkness. We're bringing our shame out of the darkness into the light. The light of a white pen, of a white, on the light of, like on a white piece of paper, or the white of the screen, the Zoom screen.
Yes.
They're the same thing.
It is the same. It's like, for me, writing was the first step. The second step was to actually speak it out loud.
Okay, yeah.
And then to not be afraid of anyone's reaction, because I know the truth, and I finally believed in myself enough to know that this was not something that was all my fault. That was my whole thing in my life, was, what have I done? What have I done? What have I done? And once I came to terms with that, and I could talk about it, it just changed me. It helped me in so many ways. I don't look any different. I don't, act any different, but inside I'm different. This has been a real, when I let myself, think about it, stop and think about it, a lot has happened in my life since 2016. And I sometimes even wonder, would I be talking about it now if my son had not come into my life? Would I have reached this point? I don't think so. I think that maybe I would have if I, continued to write about it, but I think it was such a hard buried pain that to let it bubble up. Oh, and I wanted to tell you this, Simon. The first time I told my friend Jill at the, when we were sitting there talking and just popped out of me what had happened. First time I told her, we were walking back to the car and I started having these horrible pains, almost like in my abdomen, like labor pains. It was the strangest thing. Out of nowhere, my stomach started like contracting. The muscles started contracting. Then I had a rash all over my mouth. And the rash, it was like for 3 weeks, stayed around my mouth. The rash was so intense, I went to 3 different dermatologists because it was, here's this big old red rash all over my mouth. It was very strange. They couldn't figure out what it was. They kept giving me ointments and saying, oh, I don't know, could it be stress? And all these things. Turns out, I believe it was that I was letting all this toxic information that had just, buried me. I was taking it and letting it out. And I didn't think about that till I was writing. And when I wrote about that day of finally telling her and all the things that happened as, a result, I felt, because nothing else changed in my life except I told her. And then I started all these symptoms, these weird side effects started happening. And I even had to have, the pains were so bad. And I'm not one to run to the doctor for everything. The pains got so bad that first week, I went to the doctor. They ended up doing a sonogram because I was complaining so much about the pain and how it was like contractions. And I mean, is that crazy or what? It's like your body knows. Your body has memories that we don't even realize how what's going on in our head is affecting, our body saying, let this out, let this out. And the first time I went back to the unwed mother's home was 50 years after the fact, after my son found me. And the first time I went back there, my daughter-in-law, because they live back there, and they still live in Baton Rouge. And so we went down to New Orleans. I went with my daughter-in-law because I said, I really would like to see it. I never went back to that place. And I've been to New Orleans many times, never went back there. It's no longer an unwed mother's maternity home, of course, but it is still there, the building, and it still has a big plaque on the wall saying, that it was a maternity home because it's a historic thing now. But the funny thing is, as we got out of the car and started walking up the street, I started having an anxiety attack that was so horrific. My heart was pounding, my throat was closing up, and my son and I had reunited. But still, there was that walking up to that place. Immediately, I remembered the first time I saw it. And it hadn't changed that much. It was, the neighborhood was the same. I mean, it was rundown neighborhood in New Orleans. It was just so strange and traumatic for my body to be walking up that sidewalk.
Yeah.
And knowing the last time I had walked away from there, I left my son.
So have you seen my take on the body keeps the score?
No.
My riposte to the body keeps the score. So I'm going to change it. I'll take you through the idea because I quite like it. So the body keeps the score, and from an adoptee's perspective, it's trauma one.
Yes.
Trauma one because trauma scores first. Yeah. but then adoptees get together, and teamwork makes the dream work. And it's the final score is adoptees 1. Trauma 1, adoptees united 10. Right. So now I'm going to change it, so I make it a bit more inclusive. So it's trauma 1, birth mothers and adoptees united 10.
I like that. I like that. If there's anything that I wanted my son to know, and this was very important to me, I wanted him to know how much I wanted him. And never did I ever think that this was for the best. I know he had a good life with his adoptive parents, but the more we got to know each other over the years, we became brutally honest with each other and had some great discussions. He had told me at first he never wanted to find me because he had no interest in finding me. He had a good life. He didn't need me. And his wife pretty much, pushed him to do the DNA thing and everything. And it was very hurtful, but I didn't say anything about it being hurtful. I held it inside again. I was just so glad we had, we're talking. And it was a miracle. It was like probably the most miraculous thing that I'd ever had happen in my life. The most huge, beautiful surprise I'd ever had happen in my life. And I was so, open arms. I didn't care who he was, what he was. It didn't matter. I needed to know him. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful reunion. And at first I kind of walked on eggs because I didn't want to say, I didn't want to upset him or rock the boat. Because with my other kids, I had all this history. With him, it wasn't history. It was like fresh. Here we are. Last time I saw you, you were 7 pounds, that kind of thing. And we both felt quite close quickly. And as time went on, we were very honest with each other. And he told me, I told you I didn't want to find you. The truth was I was afraid to find you. I was afraid you really didn't want me and you would reject me. And I do know that happens, and I understand there's all kinds of different reasons. And I never judge anyone if that's, if they can't handle that. I understand. It is traumatic. The reunion's traumatic as well as, the whole thing, because all of a sudden your life changes.
Yeah.
You have all these different dynamics in your life now. You have this new person that, by the way, this is my child kind of thing. And it's like that causes ripple effects. And, oh, by the way, boys, you have a half brother, and it's like all these things happen, and the family, all of a sudden you have his family is now my family. And it couldn't have gone smoother, the original reunion. But what I was getting at is that once we were honest with each other, I realized, even though he was supposed to be put with these wonderful people and they, loved him, he started telling me stories. Like he said, he never felt a complete connection with my mother. And his mother had passed away long, like 18 years before he found me. So he'd been without a mother all those years, any kind of mother. And he said he never felt that close to her. He told me stories that it wasn't that he didn't love them. It's just there were things that would happen that made him feel like he didn't quite fit in, even though he had these people that adored him. He didn't seem to have a good connection with his sister. She was adopted as well. All these things about adoption came out that I probably would have been even more anxious and upset if I had known all of this stuff about the things that really were going on. And it's, I think it's important that birth mothers, whether it's their adopted child or any adoptee, be able to talk freely about their feelings, as well as the adoptees explain how they really felt. I think it's powerful what you're doing, and bringing them together when people are willing to talk, we get an understanding of the other. You know, it's just, my son had a lot of issues about being adopted that he didn't admit to at first. And the more we got to know each other and more comfortable with each other, he began to talk about it. It was hard for me to hear, you know, because I always thought, well, they have to be a good family because, you know, people who adopt really want the child. And I justify things in my mind and hope to God he was feeling loved. So once I heard some of his stories, it was very powerful to know that he'd always wondered about me, and here I'd been wondering about him. And it was like we'd been severed from each other.
And yet, he told you that he didn't feel he fitted in.
He was a person who he had a lot of depression, and my mother was like that. And from the day I met him as an adult, as a 50-year-old man, I saw my mom in him. And he had a lot of issues, that same kind of issues she had.
Yeah.
And I look at him and I think, and you know, my mother's passed away, you know, 11 years. So she never saw him.
I'm going to go back again because I don't think it landed. He told you that the fact that he told you that he didn't feel he fitted in with his adoptive parents, to me, is a stunning testimony to your relationship with him.
He and I, this is so crazy. You know, you've always heard of nature versus nurture. We liked the same books. We liked the same plays. We liked the same movies. We liked the same food. He looked like me. His daughter, one of his daughters, looks like a clone. I never would have even met her if I hadn't, you know, if we hadn't reunited. His children, I ended up having 3 more wonderful grandchildren, beautiful people. He really had a lot of my family inside of him. And when I looked at him with my other sons, when he would come out and visit, it was just amazing. It was remarkable that the different little things I'd see similar, even though they weren't raised together. They were different because my other 3 boys, of course, had a different father and had been raised by me. But, and I think that does, you know, make a lot of differences in how we are as people, how, you know, what our families are like and how we're raised and what we believe. But God, it was so obvious that he was my son. And it was one of the biggest surprises of my life, because all those years, I mean, he was only 2 days old when I left there. And I won't tell you the story. I did go back when he was 3 weeks old. And that's when I got the birth card. So I did get to hold him one last time. And when I held him, I looked at him and I saw his father. So all those years, I thought he looked like his father. I thought, oh yeah, he'll have blonde hair, blue eyes. Well, no, he looked just like my mother. He looked like my side of the family. He used to say to me, do you think if we'd seen each other in an airport, we would have known each other? And I'd say, I don't know. I don't really, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of crazy once we found each other, how much we were alike, but you know, seeing someone walk by, I don't know if you would think that.
I'm so glad he got past his fear.
He did. And you know the end.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not the end, but
The fear of yeah, I fear that boulder came off him.
The boulder came off him. The boulder came off me. As far as our relationship was going, it was beautiful. And 4.5 years into it, because of other circumstances and some horrible things that were happening in his life. And I think also, and I'm going to be frank, I think there was some mental illness in some ways. And he ended up taking his life. And at first I was so devastated, of course, and crippled. I had just signed with a publisher, and I almost didn't publish the book. I was in such pain. But 6 or 7 months into it, a few things happened. And my husband and I talked about it. I said, you know what? It was almost like I had some signs that I should do this, some different things that happened in my life. And so and he had loved the book. He had read the manuscripts, because I wrote 5 drafts before I published. But anyway, he said, he didn't say, I said to myself, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go forward with it and publish. So I called my publisher and said, I do want to publish it. Yeah. And I think he would be proud of the fact that the story is there, because he loved when I told him the story and when he read my writing. I think the best thing in my life was the fact that I had him in my life for 4.5 years, that I ended up with his children to love, that I knew he was a good man. I knew he had a beautiful life in many ways, but I knew he was a damaged person. And I think that was a gift to get to know him. Now I look at it totally different 2 years later after the fact. And I realized this is good, because I think my book has actually helped people. They've told me it has, and it was meant to be. And it's kind of my story of him.
So listeners, check out this book, right? So you're a writer. What would you like to call this episode of the podcast?
Oh, I don't know. Whatever. I'm a writer, but I always have to think a lot. I'm not like
You have to think about it.
I do a lot of contemplating before I write. Well, the name of my book, as you know, is You'll Forget This Ever Happened. I always have a handy copy right here. And the reason it's You'll Forget This Ever Happened is because that's what us girls were told. We were told we would forget this. We never forget it.
No.
It's insane. How can you forget? It's so, first of all, you never forget giving birth. I don't care what anyone says, even if you're out cold, you have a baby afterward. But then secondly, you never forget, the traumatic experience of leaving the child. It's like, how could they have told us that? And how could we even have believed it? So that's why I named this book that. But you won't ever forget. And I don't care how hard you try, So I don't know what you should call it.
Okay. Well, have a think about it. It'll be a while before it goes out. So
I trust whatever you say.
Yeah. If anything comes to you. One last thing. I wrote down that your process. It went write it, then speak it. Write it, speak it, and I'm wondering what the third one is.
Write it, speak it. Help heal others. I feel like others heal me all the time by hearing the stories of adoptees, by hearing other birth mothers' stories. There's something that just is so heartwarming, painful. But just to be able to reach out to each other is huge in my life, because up until my son and I found each other, I never delved into how many support groups there were. And I didn't even know how important it was for us to support each other. I was in my own little world, too wrapped up in my own sorrow. Once I began to share my words and accept the sorrow, they give me their story, I give them my story. There's something about the give and take of that is so therapeutic and so good for us to finally be able to speak our truth.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's healing.
So I had, as you were talking, I wrote down write it, speak it, and then I put accept it as the third one.
Lovely.
But then as you were saying what you just said, then I had write it, speak it, heal it, and share it. And when
I believe that.
And when and the it is the healing. I don't know. Anyway, have you got anything you want to ask me?
Oh, I'm just thrilled with what you're doing. And I love that many a time you're interviewing people that I've met through this whole process as well, different authors. And I do have a couple of friends who are adoptees, and they did say I could give you their information. So I'm going to email that to you. I do a lot of not beta reading, but I do reading and reviews for a lot of the authors that I'm getting to know. Before their books come out, they'll send me a reader's copy, advanced reader's copy. And one of them that just wrote a story was an adoptive mom. It was from her perspective. And that was interesting too. And it was very painful. The reading the story of different things that, that she went through, her insecurities about her son. Yeah. So there's this triad is so important. And I think what you're doing is wonderful, Simon.
Thank you. And I'm going to get to meet wonderful people like you.
And I want to come, my favorite place is England.
Yeah.
And I have my Yorkshire tea right here.
Yorkshire tea, of course.
And I my next trip, I swear to goodness, I'm going to come try to see you. My next
Definitely.
trip.
Do that. Definitely.
To have a cup of tea together or lunch or something.
Because people say, the people that make Yorkshire tea say that it's actually made for Yorkshire water. Do you know what I mean? Oh. That's what they reckon. Yeah, I think they're just. And we had some. We were up in Scotland. I don't know, last September. My wife is from Scotland, and they have Scottish tea. It's specially brewed to be drunk with Yorkshire water.
Yes.
Sorry, Scottish water. It's all a bit of kidology, really. Yeah. But
well, I first had it when I was over there years ago, and I started buying it here, and the reason I loved it is because it was so delicious, and it's still delicious to me. But whenever I do go to England, I think the tea is much better there, and maybe it is the water. I don't know.
Maybe it's because I told you that the factory where they make it is about 10 miles away from me.
I love that. That is so funny. Here I'm obsessed with it. I have to control myself though, because if I drink too much of it, then I'm like wired. So I'm.
You not get decaffeinated Yorkshire tea?
No, I like the little, pump in the morning. I like that little caffeine zing in the morning. Yeah. But I try to be, I'm old. I try not to drink it in the afternoon so that I'll sleep all night. But yeah, I love tea. I love crumpets.
I love crumpets, but they've got to be crispy, not soggy, right?
Oh yeah, me too. I don't like soggy. No.
And on that note, we'll Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to listeners. We will speak to you very soon. Bye bye.